Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the topic of globalization. My guest is James Tunney, who is a qualified barrister in Ireland. He has lectured all over the world on the topic of globalization as a lawyer in the field of law. In addition, he is the author of several books. He is also a fine art painter, and his books include The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, about which we have had previous discussions. And I would encourage viewers who because today's topic is rather political in nature, who want a little more background. If you haven't viewed those videos, I'm linking to them now in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You might want to watch them first to get a sense of the depth of my guest today. He's also written 2 novels. One of them is called Blue Lies September. The other one is called Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. Dystopian novels, incidentally. Welcome, James.
Very well remembered. I have a feeling of deja vu. I think I need to see a parapsychologist. Thank you.
Yes, my consulting hours are open now. So you have a very diverse background as a scholar, as a poet, as a painter, as a teacher, a professor of law. And as a professor of law, one of your big interests has been globalization. And this is a topic that I sense amongst the viewers of New Thinking Aloud is controversial. Many people yearn for globalization and other people fear it. So let's get into it.
And as a matter of interest, what do you think the weight of the camps are in relation to the feedback that you get?
Well, the feedback isn't necessarily, it's reflective of the strength of the feelings that people have, not necessarily the numbers.
Good point, yeah.
My thing is that, my perception is that the very strong feelings of fear when especially the phrase New World Order comes up, with regard to globalization. But I think probably I'm going to suggest that the fear represents maybe 20% of the viewers, and that the other 80% are positively inclined towards globalization. That's my sense.
Well, let me try and present some of the arguments and some of the factors as I see it. Now, my last title was a senior lecturer. That's what I call it in Britain. I was a visiting professor in various universities. So I tended in the subjects that I wrote about and the subjects I lectured on to look at new areas of law, how law applied to evolving areas. So I lectured in subjects such as intellectual property, communications, technology law. I had modules in China and world trade. I've been to China a few times. I've lectured to the High Court of Beijing and the Chinese Academy of Social Science and various universities over there. And I've written extensively about those subjects, about travel and tourism law, all areas which are about the evolution of globalization. And I set up a degree program in European Union law. So that was, as I said, a degree program and a network in that domain. So I was very familiar with the discourse. I've met a number of the key personalities. I remember meeting Nigel Farage about 20 years ago and hear him talking about. So I would have come across a lot of these arguments that seem to have come up suddenly, but really were lurking there in the background.
Nigel Farage, for viewers who may not know, was a very prominent proponent of the British Brexit.
He was probably the lead. History will probably accredit him as being the main driver behind it. Yeah, and also that election, I think, had implications for other jurisdictions that we're not going to get into.
Okay.
But I've looked at. So you start off, lawyers in Ireland, for example, they would concentrate on Irish law. But since Ireland joined the European Union, that meant that we were part of a new legal system. It changed its name, the European Community, till it became the European Union. So it reflects more a movement towards a kind of federal system, like as happened in relation to states and the federal government in the United States. Yeah. So when you join and sign the treaties, what happens is you give up, you relinquish some of your legal sovereignty. So this is not a hypothetical issue, not an issue of political discussion. Legally, from a legal perspective, you're signing away some of your sovereignty. So there's no debate about that. Mm-hmm. So every country which is a member of these regional legal communities have pooled some of the sovereignty, as the court said. And they knew that when they were signing up. So the European Court of Justice, it says what the law is. As in Alice in Wonderland, words mean what I say they mean. The European Court of Justice decides, as the Supreme Court does in the United States. So the legal shift changed from nation states to regional legal communities. Yeah. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, we had the development of NAFTA and Mercosur. So we had the evolution, and the Asian countries, we had the evolution of a handful of massive regional legal communities. So the conception is not purely economic interaction. It's deeper than that. Mm. It's to effectively bring the countries together. So at the time I started teaching in Scotland, I think it was around the NAFTA discussions about NAFTA and the final agreements. And I was also interested in indigenous rights. I've always been fascinated, particularly from the Irish perspective, and interested in indigenous rights. I've written about the Mabo case in Australia, which revolutionized the rights of Aboriginal people, where the court said that they actually owned some of the land still. And that has profound implications in Australian society today. It's very interesting. So at the time of the NAFTA agreement, there was a revolution in Mexico. The Zapatistas rebelled, and they said that the NAFTA agreement will destroy the indigenous corn-based economy in Mexico, Chiapas. So this is quite amazing, and it didn't receive a lot of attention for that particular reason. So the indigenous people were engaged in an armed struggle with Comandante Marcos, who was part of this movement of indigenous people to oppose a free trade agreement. So they realized that this free trade agreement was deeper and would have more consequences than was hitherto to believe. So there's no question that there is a shift from the nation state to these regional legal community bodies. Now, if we think of what a nation state is, the nation state in Europe particularly developed after the Treaty of Westphalia a few hundred years ago, when they wanted to settle the 30 Years' War and the wars that had been going on, Catholic and Protestant wars. And with the Reformation, if we can think of King Henry VIII, of course, with the break from Rome, we have a movement towards the state and the state control. So we have a movement away from a more regional legal community that would have existed under the church, for example.
You're referring specifically to European states.
Specifically as the example, because that's where the model really began to grow, because they were the colonial powers and they were spreading the models that would exist through the empires. And if we think of, in relation to Africa, when they came to have the conferences, they divided up, they drew straight lines on a map to divide up Africa for the European powers, for the colonial powers. But there was still a notion that there was a country there, and they purported to project onto the thing European ideas. So, but strangely and paradoxically, if you look at it from a legal perspective, the Catholic Church developed its own jurisdiction in canon law, and its idea is that this will be a global regime. So you can say that the Catholic Church are one institution who have always been globalist in their conception. And the same would apply to, from a juridical perspective, to Islam, because it would view its rules as naturally encompassing the whole world. So already we can see that there has been ideas, and there are ideas, which predate some of these developments of universal jurisdiction. And any empire would seek to expand at various stages to establish law. So we see, for example, there's a slight different emphasis in the United States, in New Orleans and Louisiana. There's a slight different emphasis of law because of its links with France and the Spanish influence, different emphasis from common law jurisdiction. So the point is that there had been claims to universal jurisdiction. That's a good way to look at it. Idea that there's not just separate jurisdictions. There's one legal order, and in recent times there's a shift back towards that. So the suggestion by a lot of critics, there's a number of suggestions. There has been a lot of discourse about what's called a democratic deficit when you move from one country to a regional legal community. So when I'm talking about in Ireland, remember they had a war of independence, a civil war. They had a constitution in 1937, and then it was only declared a republic in 1948. And within a generation after being declared a republic, it's given away its sovereignty. So the period of freedom of the 26 counties, not of the entire island, was very, very, very short-lived. So there's no question that there is a relinquishing of sovereignty. And the question is, well, does the individual have the same protections in this mass system? And you have to remember as well that Ireland had a very strong legal tradition before the common law came. And that the common law partly grew up in Ireland as well when the Normans came, and they developed the systems that would be familiar in the United States as a major common law system, Australia, etc., and concepts of rights. So the rights that developed were particularly based on a Judeo-Christian idea. So and this evolved over a period of time where they increasingly recognized various rights. They regulated the powers of authorities. The barons controlled or reduced the power of the king with the Magna Carta. It laid out rights that we're familiar with, the right to a trial by a jury of your peers. They were established by people fighting to control power above them. And these rights were embedded in the Irish system, in the US system, etc., which is interesting because the source of rights is important. And if you say that the rights that an individual has are inherent in the dignity of the individual, based on that religious conception, you come to a different place than you would if you start off, say, in a Stalinist system. Now, there's a curious phenomenon that I've noticed in my lifetime. For example, if you take the issue of hate crime, okay? The idea of a hate crime was not there in common law jurisprudence because it's focused on the individual. And it seems, as far as I can tell, and it happened during the time of my legal career, that hate crime, I remember hearing it for the first time. What's this? I've never come across this term. But there's some suggestion that the idea of the hate crime came from Stalinist Russia, because when the Soviet Union came to the table at international forums about human rights, they couldn't come and say, oh yes, we protect the right to freedom of speech, we protect the right to equal. They couldn't do it. They didn't have it. So they came up with vague notions of protecting groups. So the idea of protecting groups is an idea which is recent and it's alien to the common law tradition. It's a big shift. And then in Europe, you have, for example, you have a civil law and a common law tradition, two different traditions. So it is a very, very complex process. There's no question that in these regional legal communities, things change. And the question is, it seems in Europe, like in Ireland, there's a lot of satisfaction with the European Union. So people don't seem to feel that there's any loss of rights in that sense. It seems, from what I can tell, I don't hear much discourse on that. Some people are unhappy, as we always get different perspectives. But I don't see a huge movement. There were particular there was a professor who I used to see going around Trinity, who was an economist, who took action against the state and said that they couldn't give away sovereignty, that required the country to take, or to have a referendum before. But anyway, so we have these regional legal communities. And then, of course, from there, it's kind of natural to say, well, let's bring it together. Now, we have the United Nations, and again, people would say, well, the United Nations doesn't reflect the dominant legal foundational things in certain countries, or we will have to reduce the level of protection of human rights. There's various views on the efficacy of the United Nations. And then we have another approach. And the approach the shift that I predicted when I taught law in St. Andrews in the international relations course, because the idea then was when you looked at international relations, you focus on states versus states. They call it realism in international relations theory. And I thought this focus is a bit too narrow because the world has changed. So I was trying to emphasize the fact that in the future, the legal discourse in international relations would shift to commercial issues, that they would become more significant. And this actually is what we hear in the discourse. If you listen to people that I've heard from the other side of the Atlantic, like Steve Bannon, for example, he is talking about economic nationalism, if you want to call it. Some people describe it, but they are the issues that were always going to come to the surface because there's a shift from some of the other issues that existed in a world not affected by technology to the same extent. So, but perhaps I think we have to begin to think and say, what is globalization apart from that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the major factors in globalization today is our multinational corporations. Some of them are wealthier than individual nations.
That's correct. So we have to consider that globalization, I've identified it as a legal phenomenon. You can also identify, well, of course, we have to recognize that it's an economic phenomenon. It's a technological phenomenon, commercial phenomenon, cultural phenomenon. It's all these different things. The key for me when I looked at the future, and I listened to Arthur C. Clarke's series in the 60s about the future, and his view was that once you had the satellite communications, all borders where technology rendered those things redundant. And I wrote an article on the basis of that about the digital remastering of the concept of jurisdiction and try to anticipate some of these problems that were going to transpire. So technology radically changes it. So you might argue that in fact the world governance system is here.
Yeah,
this is
some people
the issue.
do.
That is
it's the iPhone.
well, yes. I mean, these things are inevitably going to create convergence, and we will still have to deal with this system of power. Now, there's the argument against the global government, of course, is that you're going to concentrate power. In any system we look at, in a lot of systems, we can see that we might have the noblest of aspirations, but eventually there's a party comes in, a party system, and in the party there's struggle for power. If you look at the history of the Roman Empire, what is it? It's a litany of the struggle for power. I think that the history of the Roman Empire will be a good analogy to look for the future of what a future global government will be in relation to struggles for power. And unfortunately, in that context, the nice guys don't win, if you want to put it simply. The people that are more understanding, more open, they're not going to rise to the top. And we have some evidence, as far as I can see, that psychopaths are very good at rising to the top in organizations. And imagine how attractive it is to a person who loves power to get this structure that guarantees them power, because there will be individuals, there will always be a top to the pyramid. The question is, who is going to be at the top? Is it genuinely representative of the people, which is going to be a difficult thing to do with all the people in the world?
Yeah.
Is it going to represent a particular ideology? Is it going to be communist? Is it going to be crony capitalism with big corporations? Is it possible to have something in between? Because again, Karl Marx, Trotsky, Lenin, they wanted world government as well, but communism. In fact, Stalin was the only one that was against that because he was going for socialism in one country because he didn't believe it was possible. That was what a lot of the debate with Stalin and Trotsky was about, curious enough. So communism wants globalization because they believe that that's the best way for them. Capitalism wants mass markets and to be able to sell. And then we have other ideologies. And the ideology that I'm putting as most dangerous is scientism. I believe that scientism is the one that's capable of linking all the other ones and in fact playing all the other elements. And that if we think of it from, now what do we mean by scientism?
Yeah, let's define.
Yeah. I refer to not science, the scientific method, not all the good work that scientists do, but the idea that you can take science and use it as an exclusive way of seeing the world, and that view is better, and that view tells you about the meaning of life, and that view tells you about the proper ends, and that view can tell you about final causes, and that it is a superior view to everything else.
And your dystopian novel
is about that, yes. Because if I'm identifying that fear and the fear which is most significant, that would be the fear. Because if you're of that view, well, I hear scientists, and some of the scientists that I've talked to you, and other scientists, and they say, well, I'm not convinced that there's any scientific basis to morality. And you say, well, hold on a second. How can that be that this person doesn't know what's right and wrong, doesn't know that there's any concept of good and bad? So are these the people that are going to set the agenda for the future? Now, and the best person on this was C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis wrote in his novel That Hideous Strength about this fear of scientism taking over. And he believed that in the context of a world government or even a national government, with the evolution of science, that the scientists were going to take over. There was going to be a scientocracy. And furthermore, so people say, well, that's just make-believe, you're paranoid, these people are paranoid, they're afraid of things, they're xenophobic, etc. They can't change, they're behind, they're Luddites, all these things. There's a genuine and a fear there that really has to be respected. So C.S. Lewis wrote about the scientocracy, and also H.G. Wells. So you say the New World Order, people are trying to claim, well, this is something that's, in the dark or Marxist on the internet, something that has bubbled up like a will-o'-the-wisp in the darkness. But H.G. Wells wrote a book called The New World Order, and he wrote a book, The Open Conspiracy.
And he advocated for a kind of scientific elite taking over.
He advocated, that's the key point. He said, we should be open, it should be now open that we're engaged in this conspiracy. We want a scientific government. Religion is just in the way. There'll be no religion. We'll be governed by objectives, and that will guarantee peace. So they keep on claiming that peace is their objective. Although I don't see any great evidence of scientists preventing war. In fact, a lot of the wars are caused by their contributions and employment in the technologies that facilitate it. And I believe New Mexico has a history in relation to the evolution of weapons of destruction.
Absolutely, yes. The first atomic bomb was exploded here.
Exactly, yeah. So the scientists say, well, we're exploring our knowledge. Oh, well, it has to be done. And here's what because H.G. Wells anticipated the atomic bomb. And in his book where he's anticipating, he was reading about radiation, he anticipates the bomb. He didn't believe it would be so big. But he says, and then what will happen is people will realize that the world can be destroyed and the scientists will come together in a conspiracy or in a collection, which he said is something like gloriously illegal. He wasn't concerned about moral principle. The scientists will be in control and then everything will be okay. So it didn't work out like that. So you always hear this argument, just let us take over and everything is going to be okay.
So, I think Buckminster Fuller also addressed these issues and would pose the question, who would you rather have in charge, politicians or technicians? And he advocated for technicians. He thought that politicians were less effective at getting things done.
Yeah, but they might bear more resemblance to other humans than the technicians do. The problem with a certain type of mindset is that it can end up just focusing on detail, focusing on objectives. And C.S. Lewis said that if you focus on objectives and take out appeal to a higher authority, then you will end up with either fascism or communism, and they would both be destructive.
Well, religious authorities don't have a great track record either. I mean, we had the Inquisition under the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I might argue, in relation to the evidence, that if you look at the numbers involved, if just take that Inquisition thing, to some extent it's been overblown, I think. If you look at a number of the books, there's an argument that if you take that example and ignore all the achievements, the achievements over the hundreds of years, that, you know, in the scales, it's not the key issue. You could focus on other issues, but certainly if you look at the Catholic kings in Spain, if you 1492, Columbus going to America, the expulsion of Islam and Judaism from and the Reconquista, as they call it in Spain, and the conquest of the New World. Those things are of a different order. So those issues are more devastating than I think the doctrinal investigations in Torquemada, however bad they were. So certainly they don't have a good record. So that would be an argument against relinquishing power to big institutions as well. Yeah.
Well, when you talk about scientism, I know that one of, as a parapsychologist, attempting to interject an awareness of, one could call it spirit, one could call it non-local consciousness, there are many words, but we rail against scientism because the mainstream scientific culture doesn't want to recognize the empirical data of parapsychology. So a scientific regime would probably outlaw parapsychology.
I don't think so.
I meant scientistic.
Yeah. Funny enough, I don't think they'll do that. I think they'll take you over. I think that's what's going to happen. So, and I think that's what they're moving into consciousness now, and they'll begin to cherry pick what's there, incorporate it into the scientific method, ignore the sources as they always do. Science is fantastic, but it can't tell us how an anesthetic works, for example. It's unbelievable. They don't tell you about the fact that indigenous people knew how to operate these things. They don't, and that they took their knowledge. They don't tell you that how sophisticated the science is in traditional indigenous knowledge that enabled them to identify the combination of two plants necessary to create the ayahuasca experience, for example. They ignore all that, and they want to claim the benefits of everything and the responsibility for nothing. I don't see scientists explaining about how they contributed towards the destruction of the environment, how their attitudes contribute towards the destruction of nature, how their focus on exploitation and material things to the exclusion of spiritual values and with contempt for spiritual values, for example, often are the very source of the problems. And the scientists, we saw they had a bit of regret after they realized the monster they created with the atomic bomb, but it's too late. The same thing is going to happen with nanotechnology, for example, which could be devastating. Some of the experiments with biotechnology and the combination of those interacting in unanticipated ways.
Nanotechnology, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And we go back to that idea of the mad scientist that we were talking about that runs through literature. Yeah. For example, even in the Batman idea, the comics, they're talking about corruption, officials and all. I suspect a lot of these artists utilized their approach to make critiques of society that they wouldn't have an opportunity to do otherwise, and to describe in the corrupt environment. We can see that also with Alan Moore in Britain and his work as well.
Yeah, Alan Moore, the author of the Watchmen.
Yes, and it was done V for Vendetta as an interesting example. And his graphic novel V for Vendetta led to all the anonymous masks, a Guy Fawkes representative. So it's an example. you're always asking about, well, how do these things influence society? And he's as far as I understand from his description, he describes himself as a magician, so he's very aware of it.
Yes, I know that Professor Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University, in his book Mutants and Mystics, writes about a number of the great graphic novel artists and how they've been influenced by esoteric traditions.
And associated with this idea is, if we look at where science is going, so my idea is that what many scientists are preparing us for is the move away from the emphasis on natural selection to artificial selection. So we'll go back to, if you look at the upper class in the British Empire, they're always interested in breeding. The who had the breeding to be in the pyramid of control, breeding horses, breeding plants, breeding dogs. It's a fascination with that. You can see it in the background of the people who are supposedly solely interested in evolution. In Huxley's grandfather, Thomas Huxley, you can see this interest in, and associated with that came with ideas of, people forget about the racial context to that, studies of evolution. And so from that was associated, it was always there, the idea that we will be able to have evolved technical man in the future. And we even see that in Trotsky and his view of the future.
I understand and have discussed this in other interviews, for example, with Jason Giorgiani, who was a philosopher of technology, that the Chinese government now has a policy of using genetic modification to, over time, gradually increase the intelligence of the entire Chinese population.
Yes, and they also have the social credit system, which will mean that
enormous social control,
huge social control. But
computers monitoring the day-to-day activities of every citizen, using big data to determine who is a good citizen and who is not.
Yeah, the computers the artificial intelligence will do it without the discretion that used to exist in the system that you know from criminology. So it is a frightening system, and I have been very surprised how acquiescent people are to this relinquishing of control towards technology. And I have been very surprised how the leaders in these movements, whether it be Facebook or Apple or whatever like that, don't seem to have any concern, in my view, for these issues. As well as that, freedom of speech can't exist in a very controlled society. You can't have freedom of speech. And people have assumed that freedom of speech, there's been some great golden era of freedom of speech in the past. It's not true. It's been a slowly evolving thing. If you look at, for example, in the time of Queen Elizabeth, after the Reformation, Queen Elizabeth, she had the office of the Master of the Revels. So for Shakespeare to get his play published, he would have to walk up to the Master of the Revels to make sure that there was nothing in his play that offended, the government. And only with that permission could he be published. In fact, the copyright system, as it grew up in the common law system, was a system of control, not of rights for the author. It was to control the publication. So initially, when the printing press came, there was a free-for-all, all the views, and then they controlled it. Mm-hmm. So then they cut it down, and you couldn't. In fact, in my grandfather's time, looking at the military records recently, they had a concert where they were singing Irish songs, and they were raided by the military police. So this idea that there's been a great era of freedom of expression, and particularly then again, of course, 2 world wars, you've always have restrictions on freedom of speech. The value of freedom of speech, as expressed in some Supreme Court decision in the United States, is being undermined seriously by technology. And we have a lot of individuals who don't really have any knowledge about rights. They're not interested in higher order things from their own admission, as far as I can see, to make a generalization. And they will have no power in relinquishing. In fact, there is a very strong view that the evolution of the individual man or woman is to be godlike. And that is an alternative view. Mm-hmm. So
one finds that throughout esoteric culture.
It's true, esoteric, but the meaning of in this context is a bit different. So in a technological context, it's to achieve a whole range of powers that might, and perhaps live in eternity, but in a jar like a brain in a vat. I don't fancy that.
Yeah.
And I don't fancy the idea that we might be used as a battery somewhere and you wouldn't be able to turn your, unless you had studied esoteric practices, you wouldn't be able to turn your brain off. I suspect some of the Tibetan monks would be able to do that. I suspect some of the martial artists would be able to do that. But normal people wouldn't have any control over it. And this idea, and this is a thing that this is where I would part with when I look at Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary, where they seem to be going to, in the end, they were talking about consciousness linking and all this and information. I got worried about that because for me, it seems to be a prefiguration of what a lot of the technology people, we're going to have your consciousness joined in the pool. You're only a piece of meat and you can help us. And I don't like that.
What about the notion that we are actually cells in a larger organism, that the planet itself is alive?
I don't have any problem with that. Mm-hmm. But all the spiritual traditions start off on the notion that you are a very special being.
Yeah.
All the traditions say that you have an element of the divine in you, whether you be created in the image of the divine or you have the divine spark or the Atman, whatever you want. They all say that. Now, of course, excluding cases where people have been, say, cruel to animals or whatever, and they don't respect other animals because they see they're superior. The scientific method leads to that view, but not the spiritual view shouldn't do. So, from there came the idea that we have an essential dignity. Mm-hmm. The essential dignity is God-given in that sense, in the sense that it's a higher order thing. Mm-hmm. So you cut that link, as C.S. Lewis said, you won't get the same thing. It'll be very, very easy, massive resources against the view. If you stand against it, you will be just some kind of lower person on the caste, because I think a scientocracy will generate a caste system. Mm-hmm. And the people at the bottom will be the people who don't want to be involved, who don't want to have their genes manipulated. Now, I'm not talking about all the beneficial things for medical reasons and all that, but we always hear about the benefits. We don't hear about the costs. The same thing in relation to the scientific method. They'll tell us, here's the benefit. This is great. What's the cost?
Well, it seems to me that the pressing argument that I hear for some kind of a global order is that we're facing potential extinction if we can't get our act together on this planet and find some kind of unity, that there are many, many threats created by humans: pollution, nuclear weapons, nuclear waste, global warming. You can come up with a list of things that threaten the very existence of humanity on this planet. And people suggest that if we don't have some sort of global consensus, we won't be able to address these large issues.
I think there's a lot of evidence that we are in some kind of end game. I have come to that view myself. So I'm not saying that in an alarming way, but over a period of historical development. I'm not talking about the end of history or anything like that. But there are existential threats. But each existential threat you find has a scientific basis behind it. The momentum is from science, and not just science, the patent system, the intellectual property. You come up with an invention tomorrow, and you get a monopoly for 20 years to exploit a legal monopoly. And so this incentive, creates a drive forward without a braking system. Okay? Mm-hmm. So we are driving forward with a number of forces. Mm-hmm. So you hear Elon Musk appropriately say that, as far as I remember, that artificial intelligence is summoning the devil. Stephen Hawking said that it could lead to the extinction of humans. Again, more scientific forces towards, and of course, the environmental issue. Although I haven't seen in the scientific method any commitment to protecting nature and the forests. So I can understand that people are very suspicious when the people that have caused the problem, that are willing to engage in destruction of environment to get their things, turn around and say, look, we have the solution. You have been the problem. Not true. If you look at traditional societies, for example, Now, I know there's counter-arguments and they begin to revisit that and change it, but their impact on the environment, you know, I know there's a discourse on that, but it wasn't as big as a mechanized military industrial complex. And the scientists are not very good on stopping wars happening. They've singularly failed on that. They're not interested in that. There's no evidence that they have ethical considerations which derive from their system of knowledge that stop these things. And they say, well, that's other people's choices. But still, they're engaged in this process. So I understand the argument, and I understand also, here's the other problem, that if you look at these Bohemian Grove, Bilderberg, we see people meeting.
People who are very wealthy and powerful who join together in associations and clubs and discuss issues like the future of governance on the planet.
Exactly. And who are probably the incipient or elements of the incipient world government, of course, that won't be able to exclude China and Russia and other countries in that, because it's not going to happen, barring a catastrophic war that I know some elements seem to want. There's always a drive to war in that. But, sorry.
Well, it needn't be a war. It could be any kind of large-scale global catastrophe could catalyze some sort of a dramatic movement toward a global regime of some sort.
Yeah, well, we see that in Independence Day and the aliens coming, but we also have to anticipate. Unfortunately, if you look at the history of the United States, for example, or other countries, we see that it's very, very easy to create a pretext for war. I still don't understand the forces that led to all the British and Irish joining up to enlist to go and be slaughtered in the trenches in war. It's beyond my comprehension. After reading all, I cannot understand how that happened. You can begin to understand when you look at factors such as the fact that they had open-ended contracts for armaments production. So they were going to produce weapons to the best of their capacity, and in a way, the individuals were sacrificed to these weapons. And it's interesting, of course, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, of course. C.S. Lewis, who comes from Ireland, and Tolkien meeting in Oxford, and Tolkien being in the First World War. Well, Tolkien came back with his fantasies and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder, but does that fantasy help in any of the situation in relation to the issues? Does it address any of what was going on, or is it an escape? Is it a useful contribution? On the other hand, Lewis was trying to say, well, what does this mean? Why is these things happening? Because there have to be some preventative mechanism. And where I think we're getting to is that the finality is that there has to be a reckoning between people who are taking a spiritual path and people who believe that we are machines who can be improved by technology, and that's all we are, and that there's nothing special about consciousness, may not even exist, and we should relinquish our consciousness to the greater good, to the more intelligent artificial intelligence, and there's nothing special. So that's where we're coming to. So that's why what we talked about in relation to mysticism, irrespective of whether you're Hindu, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, it doesn't matter. There is a similarity of interest in relation to emphasizing the importance of spiritual values and not utilizing spiritual traditions as an excuse to promote division and war. That's not what spirituality should be about. It should be about the opposite, the counterforce to that. And we can even see it in Star Wars. We know that Star Wars was influenced heavily by Joseph Campbell's idea. We have an empire, and we have people fighting against an empire, and we have the Force, which I believe that George Lucas studied mystical traditions to come up with a concept of the Force. Comes
through very strongly in that series, yes.
Yeah, and we can also think of Philip K. Dick, the great Californian novel writer who anticipated with Blade Runner and a number of these films that people are familiar with, where the future was going through mystical experiences. He had this vision that we were still living in what he called a black iron prison, which was controlled by the Roman Empire, which had never gone away. He saw that. Mm-hmm. He thought it was manifesting itself in the Nixon administration. Mm-hmm. That was his perception. And we were talking about that in relation to Archibald Cox, who I met. Yes. Name drops. So Philip K. Dick was very interested in that, but he foresaw a dystopian result in relation to the control of technology.
Well, I think it ultimately may boil down to human nature itself. If there's going to be any kind of a global coming together, whether it's governmental or organic in some sense, we have to deal with our own nature, who we are. One might say we're primates. We do have aggressive instincts. We do have an urge to be the dominant alpha male in society. Many spiritual traditions address this, though, overcoming our animal nature.
Well, the problem is that when I was in teaching in Britain, and I was watching the run-up to the Iraq War, and I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out that there was millions of people marching on the streets. Yeah. So the public didn't want the war. So you're talking about what people want. They didn't want that war. I was over here on 43rd Street, I think, and Colin Powell's car went down to go to the United Nations to do that presentation, the false information about the weapons of mass destruction in there. And we had a devastating war, and that had a profound effect on me. Mm-hmm. That hearing all these things about how nice people were, that it didn't matter. The war was going to happen because there's interest, and I was amazed that the public couldn't impede that, and that's quite frightening. So, and the public seems to be quite persuadable on things which are dangerous to the general good. So here it comes back to the individual. The individual has to be a whole person. So that's what holy means. And that's what healing involves. All the words come from a similar root. So we have to be a whole person, as in the yin-yang thing, recognize the diversity. But in that, we have to accept that we have a body, mind, and soul. We have to look after our body as best we can. Take your vitamins, do the exercise, do the yoga, do the walking, do your martial arts, we have to do that. We have to look after our mind. We have to look at what we can see in this limited reality and the limited sliver on the electromagnetic spectrum and listen to what we're saying. We have to be able to be critical individuals who are sovereign. And we have to have our spirituality, in my view. And there's various, the French philosopher who wrote the article, who couldn't understand how so few people could control so many. And he concluded that it was on the basis of the relinquishing of control of people. So we are guilty of that. It's not that people say, I have nothing to do with that. We relinquish our control. We relinquish it through our attention. So if we spend all our time with the minimal free attention we have on reality TV, for example, or things, well, that's what we're worshipping. That's what we're giving our attention to. And if it's at the expense of the things in the background, you find as well the big jumps in attention in reality TV when there's something nefarious going on in the background. Yeah. We're guilty in not focusing our attention. So there is evidence from Dean Radin and the Institute of Noetic Science about how individuals meditating can affect the world. So my argument is there hasn't been enough genuine commitment to the growth of individuals who may be able to create mass movements or of themselves, where they're individuals, where they're magnetized and moved by a genuine commitment against war or whatever, as was in Berkeley in relation to the Vietnam War. That's philosophy. But that can't be manipulated. We always have to be careful, because what I believe has happened in the left-right politics is there are people moving between. So what we think was a left-wing position may be not actually a left-wing. What we think was a conservative, it was not. So that philosophy is there in relation to ideas of entryism and things like that. So we have to be very, very critical. We can't relinquish sovereignty. We have to inform ourselves, and we still have to grow as an individual. Edith Stein, the Jewish Catholic convert, she was still practicing her view when she was in Auschwitz before she died. So the journey in the spirit never happens, even in the most horrendous circumstances. But I would say,
I think what you meant to say is the journey in the spirit is never squashed.
And it's never squashed. That's correct. It's never squashed. It's never over, and it will never stop because of external conditions. In fact, that's when it's most valuable. That spiritual courage from the heart, accord, etc. So, I would say to you that what I'm afraid of in all these debates is that it's very easy to manipulate us. I believe, actually, if you look at 1949, the cybernetics group in London, you had a Macy conference over in the United States, but in London you had the Ratio Club. And these were all the people who were interested in computers and behavioral science. And they met in the basement of the Queen's Hospital near Russell Square in London. They had Alan Turing was there before he began to be persecuted. And they were looking at cybernetics. A lot of them had been involved in the Second World War. And they set about looking at how they were going to be able to control human behavior. So these guys now know more about us than we do ourselves. And we're easily manipulated. And they have formulas and algorithms that can manipulate us. And you notice, as in imperial systems, the primary policy is to divide and conquer. So what you do is you divide into two groups, and then they're still going against you. You divide into other groups. You create different things. You create reasons why that group. That's very handy because then you can proceed with your agenda.
And that seems to be happening across the globe. It's
happening across the globe. So I don't want people to be forced into a group. I'm for this, I'm against that. I'm for this, I'm against that. There has to be a middle ground. If the middle ground disappears, as Yeats said, the center cannot hold and all things fall apart. If the middle ground, consistent with ideas in Buddhism, consistent with ideas in Vedanta, consistent with ideas in Christianity, remember again, Jesus said, well, he was there with the Roman Empire, and he's saying, but render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So my kingdom is not of this world. That's what the spiritual tradition says. So Jesus, if you look at it in an esoteric idea, Jesus was crucified on Calvary, Golgotha. The head, the skull is the Calvarium. There's the sutures cross on the head. The fontanelle is important in relation to Buddhists. And when you die, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the soul is believed to exit that way, or maybe come in that way. And the spirit was released on Calvary from in esoteric tradition by the Christian thing, emphasizing that the superior, the place of the skull above the temple, the spirit was the most important thing, irrespective of what the external thing is. The problem is, if there's an existential threat to all mankind, or to all spiritual traditions, well then the question is, well, how does that persist? But that may be the end game. That may be the destiny of humans that are not intelligent enough with all their wisdom, with all their scientific data, with all their cybernetics, not intelligent enough to prevent their own destruction by discourse and the better angels of our nature. Well, then the question might be, is that not the destiny of this species? But why people would want to sacrifice the noble things that we do know for a kind of mechanical dream is something I can't fathom. But a lot of people seem to be willing to do that. And the preoccupation with mobile devices, which will become wearable devices, which will become implants that you won't be able to opt out of, is happening.
I should mention, for benefit of our viewers, when I asked you for a cell phone so I could meet you at the airport in Albuquerque, you informed me you don't use a cell phone.
That's right. And I don't even drive, which is strange in America. But we still met.
Yes. And you're here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's nobody bothering me on my mobile phone. But I mean, there is an important thing. When you have a screen that takes your attention, you have to remember that if we accept that we're living in this restricted sliver of perception, and then that's not an accurate reflection of reality, and then we put a screen in our view. A screen is meant to give us a window on the world, but a screen also keeps things out. Sun screens keeps things out. Yeah. So this screen takes out more reality. We're being driven into a situation where it's very easy to play puppet master with us by machines, by people who have extracted all the data. And one legal point which is important, I don't want to miss this point. You may have noticed a lot of interest in data protection in recent years. Where did the concern for data protection come from? It came from realization that the Nazis would not have been able to persecute the groups that they did if they hadn't had a card index system, IBM, that they were able to use and identify who people were. So they were able to identify using the census as well, which I believe that there was one of the census had identified people by religion. They were able to identify where they were. So afterwards, after the Holocaust, people began to say, well, maybe we should be careful with our data. And we shouldn't be used, because you don't know in the future who's going to be in control. So the groups that are being celebrated now and are voluntarily given all the information that they want and subscribing to certain identities may be persecuted in the future. We have to be cautious about this in the long term. You can't take short-term factors where we're being played by other people. In the end, every individual on this planet every individual, irrespective of what creed they are, or skin color, or it doesn't matter. Every individual is special. And if they begin to realize that and believe in it and ignore some of the other nihilistic doctrines of existential despair that's promoted not just by science, but also in a lot of literature. I think of Samuel Beckett, for example, an Irish writer, very gifted, but he takes away the mystery and leaves the misery in its place. I don't fancy that. I'd rather the mystery rather than a misery. So we have to be careful.
Well, James Tunney, once again, an eloquent exposition of very complex issues that have troubled me for quite a while. But I feel heartened in the sense that this discussion is really one of the reasons that I keep putting out these videos 3 times a week. I think it's just so important for people to be able to think these things through. And I value very heartily your emphasis on the individual.
Yes, that's critical. And again, I have to thank you for being so kind and so helpful and so interesting to engage with. You're really impressive in the way you make me feel relaxed and able to get the points across. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for being with me. I think many of our viewers who have gotten this far are also very grateful to you.
Okay, I appreciate that, yeah.
And thank you for being with us.